My name is Elena from Mirrix Looms, and today I'm going to show you how to warp a Mirrix loom for tapestry. Now, you can use all of our looms except for the 5-inch mini Mirrix, which is our smallest loom for tapestry weaving. They all either come with a shedding device or you can get a shedding device with them. So this right here is a 12-inch little guy loom. That's the loom I'm going to show you on. Now you can see that I have placed my loom on these two little boxes. I did that to leave space under the loom for warping. So you can place your loom on books, on bricks, on anything that just elevates the loom a little bit to make a space underneath it. And it is sitting up with these two fold-out legs in the back of the loom. All the looms 12 inches and larger have fold-out legs, and the 8-inch loom has one fold-out leg. So the first thing we're going to do is decide on the height of our piece, so how long we want our piece to be. We can adjust that by turning these wing nuts and moving the loom up or down. Once we've decided on the height, we're just going to measure each side to make sure our loom is even. Now what we're going to do is we're going to choose what warp coil we're going to put on the top of our loom. This depends on the warp and the weft that you're using. You can look on our website for more information on how to choose a warp coil. So we just place that there on the top. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our wooden clips and swing them so the indentations are in the back of the loom. Then we're going to take our warping bar here, and we're just going to place that in those indentations and push our clips inward slightly so that warping bar is stable. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our warp thread, whatever you want to use. This is a Navajo wool warp, and we are going to tie onto the warping bar. Now where you tie on depends on how wide of a piece that you want to make. So if you're going to make a piece that's almost the width of the loom, fairly wide, then you can center the piece. If you're going to make a really thin piece, or if you're going to make a, depending on the width of the loom. So if you're going to make a fairly thin piece on a 38-inch loom, you're going to want to put that piece on one side of the loom. And this is because if you do it in the middle, the warping bar will be not balanced. So you warp on one side, and then on the other side, you just tie some kind of ribbon, something like this, onto the other side of the warping bar to keep that balanced. Or you can actually warp more than one piece on each side of the loom to balance that warping bar. So once we've decided where we want our piece to be, we just tie on. Tie right on there. And then we're going to begin warping, which is actually a very easy process. We're going to start by going underneath our loom, from the back to the front, around the front, and when we hit our warp coil here, we're just going to place our warp thread in one of the dents, which is a space in that warp coil. And then when we come down, when we hit our warping bar, we're going to go around the warping bar and come back in the direction that we came. And that is the big thing to remember about warping, is every time we hit our warping bar, we're just going to come back in that same direction. So I'm going to come around the front, and now I'm going to place my warp thread in the next dent over. Sometimes for tapestry, we may want to be weaving with our warps a little bit further apart, and then maybe we would do every other dent, but for this, we're going to do every dent. We're just going to bring our warp thread around the loom, and then when we're here and hit our warping bar, we're going to loop around that warping bar. So it's not a full circle around the warping bar. You're not going to hit it and go all the way around. You're just going to go around once like that, and then come back in the direction that you came from. So here we're going to go into the next dent over, around our warping bar, into that next dent, around the loom. Now it's important when you're warping to remember not to drop your warp thread. So we don't want to stop in the middle of warping and get the door or answer the phone, because we want to keep our tension even. It doesn't necessarily have to be tight, really, at all. It just needs to be even. And if you drop your warp thread while you're warping, there's a good chance that you're going to make it so your tension's not even. Now that can definitely be fixed. You can go through after you've warped and kind of pull and make sure that everything's even, but it's much easier, as is everything with warping, to do it correctly the first time. So you don't have to go back and fix any mistakes. So you can see we're just doing the same thing. The process is very, very simple. Around the front of the loom. And then when we hit the warping bar, we're just going to come back in the direction we came from. So we're just going to continue doing that. Again, we hit the warping bar, come back from the back of the loom, around the top from the back to the front, into the next end over, down the front of the loom, then from the front to the back. Then we're going to hit the warping bar. We're going to come back in the direction we came, bring the warp from the back to the front now, back around, and then into the next end over on the top. And then we just repeat that process over and over and over, and it becomes very, very second nature. So sometimes people think coming into it that this process is difficult, just the concept of warping seems difficult, but it really is very simple. And once you start to understand how it works, then you won't have any trouble at all. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're warping is not to go into the middle of the loom. So you may want to periodically put your hand through to make sure you haven't accidentally crossed over. You know, it's easy if you're not paying attention to come here and then forget what you're doing and go up here and have crossed over. So you're always wrapping around the outside of the loom. You are never going to be going through the center. So again, we just hit our warping bar. As you can see really what a fast process this is. So now when you have as many warp threads as you want, so when your piece is as wide as you want, what you're going to do is just tie back on to the warping bar. So I'm just going to cut off my warp thread, and then right here I'm going to tie a knot. Now it's important to make sure this is an even knot because you want your thread to be even on both sides. So once we even everything up, this is the first part of warping, all done. So now that we've finished this first part of warping, what we're going to do is we're going to bring our warping bar down to the bottom of the loom. Now what the warping bar does is once you've brought it down here, if you've woven up as far as you can weave, what you can do is loosen your tension, take that warping bar and start bringing it back up the back of the loom, and this will rotate your piece around to the back of the loom, giving you more space to weave on the front of the loom. So I'm going to bring my warping bar down just by swinging those clips out and then pulling this warping bar right down here. Now you can see, because I've warped more on one side, a kind of thin piece, that the warping bar is a little bit uneven. So I'm just going to take this ribbon here and tie it onto the other side of the warping bar just to keep that even. So I tie it onto the bar, and then I'm just going to wrap it around the loom. Just to support that warping bar. And I want to just make sure that my tension here is about the same as my tension right there. So once I've done that, I'm ready to tighten my tension a little bit because I haven't put my heddles on my loom yet. I'm not going to make it so tight, but a little bit tighter than when I warped it. So there we go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these wooden clips and I'm going to swing them around. Now if these are loose at all, when you're putting your warping bar on, or now, you can always tighten with these white plastic screws in the back to make sure they're not falling down. Now you're going to take your shedding device and you're going to place it in the indentations. Now if you are right-handed, you're going to want this little hole here, which is where the handle for the shedding device goes, on the right side. If you're left-handed, you're going to want it on the left side. So you're going to place it with one bar on the top, and then you're going to just unscrew this. We actually have an Allen wrench if that's a little bit tight. And you're going to bring your bar out. Now we are going to start putting heddles on. So this is a heddle. You can either buy a heddle from us or you can make your own. It's basically just a circle of a very strong thread. So you can go on our website to either buy or learn how to make these yourself. Now basically what you're going to do is you are going to place a heddle around every other warp thread. So you're going to place it around and then you're going to put it on the bar. So basically what you're doing is, if my finger was a warp thread, you're going to place the heddle around it like that and then place it on the bar. So just like that. So I've put it in one, I'm going to skip the next one, and then I'm going to place my heddle right there. So, and then I skip one, put it on the next one, and I'm just going to continue doing that. Now, it's very important during this process to make sure that you're not making a mistake. Because if you make a mistake, if you accidentally skip one or don't skip one, then you really have to go back and redo it. So it's very helpful to do it the first time correctly. It's also very helpful to make sure that you keep your heddles organized. So, make sure nothing's crossing over. Just take your time during this process. So, here's my next one. So basically what this is going to do is it's going to allow you, when you move the shedding device, to lift up half of your warp threads. And then the other way to lift up the other half. So I have this all done. I'm just going to check, make sure that's correct. And when I'm done, I'm going to place this right here and re-screw in this screw. So now what we're going to do is we're going to flip over our shedding device. So this next bar is on the top. And we're just going to do the same thing, but with opposite warp threads, so different warp threads from before. So I'm going to check here. I see that this warp thread has a heddle on it, and I'm going to put the one that doesn't have put a heddle on the one that doesn't have a heddle. So this one has a warp thread on it. And this is really the tricky part about putting heddles on. It's just making sure that you're doing it correctly. That you're putting your heddles on the correct warp threads. And you just want to go and check. And keep checking as you warp, especially if you have a really wide piece. You don't want to make a mistake in the middle of all of that and have to go back. If you do make a mistake, there are ways to fix it though. Let's say I put this on the wrong warp thread and I didn't realize until much later that I had made that mistake. What I could do is I could go and I could actually cut that heddle off and tie something onto there because sometimes it's just too much work to put all the heddles on again, especially on larger pieces. So there are ways to work around it, but you want to avoid having to do that. Another thing you can do to check is to move the shedding device as you're warping. So you can kind of see that everything is moving along correctly. Because you'll be able to see, if I lift this up, I could see if I had really missed a heddle somewhere. So this is my last heddle. Putting that right on. Make sure this is not twisted. Alright, and then I'm just going to place that back in here. And I'm going to tighten this. Now I'm going to take their little brass pieces here at the top. I'm just going to take those and swing them over to keep the shedding device on securely. Now you may need a Phillips head screwdriver to loosen or tighten these. I like to keep them just tight enough so they hold securely, but not too tight that I have to go and get a Phillips head screwdriver every time I put them on. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my shedding device handle. I'm just going to place that right here and then screw on the back. Little screw here. And so now you can see that when you move your shedding device into the one position, you've lifted up half your warp threads. And when you move it into the other position, you've lifted up your other half. So I'm going to place my loom on a steadier surface. I'm going to put my shedding device in the neutral position, and I'm going to tighten my tension. Now, one of the great things about the Mirrix Loom is what wonderful tension you can get. So you really want to make this tight. Probably tighter than you think if you're not a tapestry weaver. So at this point, I'm going to even everything out. And look at that. Looks like we did everything correctly. Now the last thing that you want to do is take your spring bar. This is most important for tapestry. And you're just going to place it in the spring. Do it from this side at the top of your loom. So you place it in front of your warp threads. And this just prevents, because your warp threads may be thick from when you're moving the shedding device, you don't want it to come out, which it usually doesn't do, but just in case, it is nice to have that there. So that's it. You are all ready to start weaving. Start weaving in. One thing you're going to want to do when you start weaving is actually take a piece of warp thread and tie it to one side through your threads to the other side and then back around and then tie that, and that'll just give you a kind of bottom, so when you begin weaving your header it doesn't start sinking down the loom. That will give it a place to keep your weaving up when you start weaving. So there you are, all ready to begin.